The phone rang on a quiet morning, 3 days after the funeral. The house still smelled like flowers no one had the strength to throw away. I almost let it go to voicemail, because in that moment nothing felt urgent anymore. But when I heard the voice on the other end, calm in a way that didn't fit an ordinary call, saying my full name as if he had known me for years, something tightened in my chest. Then he said he needed to talk to me about my wife. Not about her death, but about every Monday that came before it. He didn't explain himself. He didn't apologize. He didn't soften his words. He simply said that for 35 years she had been there every Monday morning. Same time, same office. Always saying everything was fine. And now, after she was gone, there was something I needed to know. Something she never told me. Something that would change the way I remembered our marriage, our silence, and every moment I chose to trust without asking questions. Before I could respond, the call ended. I stood there staring at the phone in my hand as if it could explain what I didn't yet understand. My wife had always said it was just a routine appointment. She always came back smiling. She always told me there was nothing to worry about, and for 35 years, I believed her. Until that moment, when I realized the truth hadn't disappeared with her. It had been waiting for me. My name is Daniel Harper. I'm 71 years old, and until recently, I believed my life was painfully ordinary in the best possible way. I spent decades working with my hands, fixing what was broken, showing up early, leaving late, and coming home to the same woman every night. We lived in a quiet neighborhood where mornings smelled like fresh coffee and cut grass, and nothing ever felt urgent enough to question. My wife, Eleanor, was the kind of person people trusted without realizing why. She spoke softly, remembered names, and never raised her voice, even when she disagreed. If something hurt, she carried it. If something worried her, she folded it into her routine and kept moving. When she told me she had an appointment every Monday morning, I didn't press her for details. I nodded. I trusted her. That was how our marriage worked. Every Monday, she left the house just after sunrise, purse over her shoulder, hair neatly pulled back, always with the same calm expression. She never rushed, never looked nervous, never acted like someone carrying bad news. By the time I returned from my own errands, she was usually back, already preparing lunch, already asking me about my day, as if those hours never existed. Looking back, I realize how easy it was to accept that version of reality. 35 years is a long time to repeat the same story without interruption. When someone you love tells you everything is fine often enough, it stops sounding like reassurance. It becomes a fact. And I built my entire sense of safety around that fact, never imagining that silence itself could be doing all the talking. For most of our marriage, Mondays were the quietest day of the week. No family dinners, no long conversations, no visitors stopping by unexpectedly. Just the sound of the front door closing softly behind Eleanor as she left, and the familiar stillness settling back into the house. I never watched her drive away. I never checked the clock. Mondays didn't feel important enough to remember. She always came back the same way she left, calm, polite, present. If I asked how her morning went, she would smile and say it was fine, sometimes adding a small detail about traffic or the weather, nothing that invited a follow-up question. There was no tension in her voice, no hesitation in her eyes. If she had been hiding something, she did it with a grace that made hiding feel unnecessary. Over the years, the appointment became part of the background of our life, like a distant train you hear so often you stop noticing it. Holidays didn't interrupt it, birthdays didn't delay it. Even on weeks when everything else changed, Monday morning stayed exactly the same. I told myself that kind of consistency was comforting, that it meant stability, that it meant nothing was wrong. Sometimes I think about how many chances I had to ask more. Not confrontational questions, not suspicious ones, just simple curiosity. But marriage teaches you rhythm, and rhythm teaches you restraint. You learn which moments to protect and which ones to let pass. and for reasons I can't fully explain, I always chose to let Mondays pass. There were moments, small and almost invisible, when something felt slightly off. Not enough to alarm me, just enough to brush against the edge of my awareness. Some Mondays she came home quieter than usual. Other times she went straight to the bedroom before starting lunch, sitting on the edge of the bed for a few minutes as if she needed to collect herself. When I asked if she was tired, she nodded and smiled, and I accepted that answer because I wanted to. I told myself everyone has private routines, everyone has corners of their life they don't narrate out loud. I believed respect meant not asking for access to every door, and so I didn't notice how carefully she kept that door closed, how perfectly she made sure nothing leaked through. For 35 years, I mistook her silence for peace, and I never once considered that peace might be the most exhausting thing she carried. Eleanor wasn't the kind of woman who made a scene. She didn't slam doors. She didn't raise her voice. She was the kind of steady presence people leaned on, the kind neighbors described with the same words every time: dependable, sweet, strong, like she'd been born knowing how to carry things without dropping them. That's why it took me so long to notice the pattern hidden inside the pattern, because from the outside, everything looked normal. Her hair always brushed back the same way, her purse always on the same shoulder, her keys always in the same pocket of her coat. But there were weeks when she came home and stood in the kitchen doorway for a second too long, like she'd stepped into a room that belonged to someone else. I remember one Monday in early spring, the kind of morning where the sunlight looks clean and the air smells like wet grass. She returned a little before noon, and I was at the table sorting through mail. She set her purse down gently, the way she always did. Then her hand stayed on the strap longer than it needed to, as if letting go was harder than usual. I asked her, just casually, how it went. She nodded once, and her smile came a beat late. Not dramatic, not obvious, just enough that if you love someone long enough, your body notices before your mind does. I told myself she was simply tired. She'd always been the kind of person who gave her best energy to the world first and saved whatever was left for home. Over time, there were other little things. The way she started keeping her phone face down on Mondays when she used to leave it anywhere without thinking. The way she'd wash her hands twice when she got home, not like a habit, more like a ritual. The way she'd sometimes take a shower at an odd hour, saying she just wanted to freshen up, even though she hadn't broken a sweat. And there was the calendar. Not the one in the kitchen that we used for birthdays and dentist appointments. I mean, the small one she kept tucked inside a drawer. The one I only saw once when I was looking for a screwdriver. It wasn't even open. I just saw the edge of it, the neat corners, the kind she liked. When she noticed me near that drawer, she closed it with her hip without looking, like it was nothing. That should have been my moment, the moment I paused, the moment I asked, but I didn't. Because after decades of love, you develop a dangerous confidence. You start believing you know your marriage. You start believing that if something were wrong, it would announce itself. You start believing the people you trust would never let you stand on the edge of the truth without warning you. So I kept living. I kept eating lunch with her. I kept watching our shows at night. I kept holding her hand when we crossed streets. And all the while I never realized that one day, a Monday would come where she wouldn't walk back through that door. And everything I thought was ordinary would turn into the loudest, unanswered question of my life. The first explanation came to me weeks after she was gone. Not from evidence, not from a confession, but from memory. It arrived quietly, the way doubts usually do, slipping in during moments when the house felt too empty to ignore. I started replaying conversations from years ago, moments I hadn't thought about since they happened, sentences that felt harmless back then, but now carried a strange weight. There was a time, long ago, when Eleanor mentioned a doctor by name. Just once. We were sitting at the kitchen table, eating leftovers, talking about nothing important. She said his name casually, the way you'd mention a mechanic or a pharmacist, and I remember nodding without asking who he was. At the time, it didn't matter. Now, it echoed louder than it should have. I told myself it must have been something medical she didn't want to worry me with. That explanation felt reasonable, comforting even. People hide diagnoses all the time, especially from the ones they love, especially when they don't want to be seen as fragile. I convinced myself that maybe those Mondays were about protecting me from fear, from hospital rooms, from words that change how you look at someone forever. Once that thought took hold, everything else seemed to line up. The tiredness, the quiet moments after she came home, the way she sometimes sat alone before rejoining me in the kitchen. I imagined waiting rooms, white walls, clipboards, the kind of places where time stretches and thoughts get heavy. It made sense. Too much sense. For a while, that explanation gave me something dangerous, closure without truth. It allowed me to grieve in a way that felt contained, manageable. I could tell myself she had been strong, that she carried her burden alone because that was who she was, that the story ended there with quiet sacrifice and misplaced trust. But there were cracks in that version of events, small ones at first, the kind you ignore because you want the structure to hold. Eleanor never complained about pain, not once. She never changed her diet, never mentioned new medication, never brought home paperwork or appointment cards, and despite 35 years of those Mondays, she never once missed a family event because of them. Then there was the call itself, the doctor's voice, the way he spoke. It wasn't the tone of someone closing a chapter. It was the tone of someone opening one. He didn't sound relieved that the secret was over. He sounded careful, almost restrained, like he was choosing his words in advance. That was when the explanation that almost made sense began to feel thin. Not wrong, just incomplete, like a picture missing its center. And I realized something that made my stomach tighten. If those Mondays were only about her health, then there would be no reason for the truth to wait until after she was gone. No reason for silence to last 35 years. No reason for a phone call that felt more like a warning than a condolence. And for the first time since the funeral, I understood that whatever she had been doing every Monday morning, it wasn't just about her. It involved someone else. Something else, something that had been carefully kept out of my line of sight, and whatever it was, it hadn't ended with her life. It had only paused, waiting for me to catch up. I didn't start searching for answers right away. At first I told myself there was no rush. Grief has a way of convincing you that time should slow down, that certain doors can stay closed a little longer. But the silence of the house began to press in on me, especially on Monday mornings, when the hours she used to be gone now felt louder than any noise she ever made. So I did what felt harmless. I looked for patterns, not secrets, just patterns. I went through old calendars, the ones we used to hang in the kitchen year after year, flipping through pages filled with birthdays, anniversaries, oil changes, and dentist visits. Mondays were never marked, not once. 35 years of appointments, and not a single note. That should have unsettled me more than it did. I checked bank statements next, not because I suspected anything improper, but because routine leaves footprints. Gas charges on the same day. Coffee from the same place near the office district. Small, consistent expenses that pointed in a familiar direction. Everything lined up with the idea of a medical visit. Nothing jumped out, nothing screamed secrecy, and that almost frustrated me more than if something had. Then there were the clothes. It sounds insignificant, but grief sharpens your attention in strange ways. Eleanor always wore the same coat on Mondays, a light grey one, simple, practical, clean but never new. I realized I couldn't remember seeing her wear it any other day. It wasn't her favorite, it was her Monday coat. The thought stayed with me longer than it should have. I drove the route she would have taken early one morning just to see if anything felt familiar. The traffic lights, the turn onto the main road, the stretch where the city shifts from residential to professional, offices giving way to clinics, clinics to older buildings with names you stop reading after a while. I told myself I was just orienting myself, that I wasn't really looking for anything. When I finally stood outside the medical building the doctor had mentioned, I didn't go in. I sat in my car and watched people come and go, nurses, patients, delivery drivers, normal life moving through glass doors. It all reinforced the story I had been telling myself. This was where she went. This was all there was to it. I almost felt relieved. But something didn't sit right. The timing, the length of her absence. Some days she was gone longer than any routine appointment would require. Other days she returned sooner than expected. And no matter how many times I tried to fit those variations into a reasonable explanation, they resisted. Like pieces from different puzzles forced into the same box. That was when I realized I had been following the trail that made me feel safest, the one that kept Eleanor intact in my memory, strong, private, selfless. But grief doesn't just reveal love, it reveals avoidance. And as much as I wanted the story of a hidden illness to be true, it was beginning to feel like a story I had chosen, not one that had chosen me. Because if those Mondays were only about her health, then my questions would have led somewhere by now. Instead, every answer circled back on itself. Every detail pointed forward, then disappeared. And for the first time, I wondered if the reason I couldn't find the truth wasn't because it was buried. It was because I was standing in the wrong place, looking in the wrong direction. The first real crack didn't come from a document or a place. It came from a person. Someone I hadn't spoken to in years. Someone who recognized me before I recognized them, standing a few feet away in a grocery store on a quiet afternoon. She said my name with a careful tone, the kind people use when they're not sure if they should speak at all. She had known Eleanor for a long time, longer than I realized. Not a close friend, not someone who came over for dinner, just a familiar face from another part of her life, someone who knew about Mondays. When she mentioned them casually, as if they were common knowledge, something in me tightened. I asked what she meant, trying to keep my voice steady, trying not to sound like a man grasping for answers. She hesitated before responding, looked down at her cart, then said that Eleanor used to talk about those mornings as if they were important, not stressful, not frightening, just important. She said Eleanor always seemed focused afterward, like someone who had just finished something necessary, not relieved, not afraid, just resolved. That word stayed with me longer than the rest. I asked if she knew where Eleanor went. She shook her head slowly and said she never asked, that Eleanor wasn't the kind of person who invited questions. Then she said something else, something that felt small, but landed heavy. She said Eleanor once told her that if anyone ever misunderstood those appointments, it would be because she wanted them to. Because sometimes the truth doesn't protect the people you love, it exposes them. That sentence didn't fit the story I had been telling myself. It didn't sound like illness. It didn't sound like fear. It sounded intentional, strategic. And for the first time, I felt the ground shift beneath the explanation I had been holding on to. If Eleanor wanted those Mondays to be misunderstood, then the misunderstanding wasn't an accident. It was part of the design. After we parted ways, I sat in my car for a long time without starting the engine. I replayed the conversation over and over, listening for things I might have imagined, hoping I had misunderstood her words. But the more I thought about it, the clearer it became that Eleanor had been managing perception, not hiding weakness. She had been controlling the narrative of her own absence. That realization opened a new set of questions I didn't want to ask. Questions about who else might have known, about what kind of truth needs decades of preparation, about why a woman who spent her life avoiding conflict would orchestrate something that required so much silence. And most of all, about what role I had unknowingly played in helping her keep that silence intact. Driving home, I passed the same streets Eleanor used to take every Monday morning, and for the first time, they didn't feel familiar. They felt staged, like a route designed not just to lead somewhere, but to lead away from something else entirely. And I understood then that whatever waited at the end of this story wasn't hidden because it was dangerous. It was hidden because it was precise. I found it by accident, the way the most important things usually appear when you're not looking for them at all. I was cleaning out the hall closet, the one we barely used anymore, filled with coats from winters that felt like they belonged to another life. I reached into the back corner and felt something solid where nothing should have been. When I pulled it out, it was a small, worn folder, tucked behind a box of old shoes. It wasn't locked. It wasn't hidden with care. It was simply placed where no one ever bothered to look. Inside, there were a few folded papers, neatly arranged, not disorganized, not rushed. Eleanor's handwriting was there, unmistakable, careful and steady, the kind that never wasted space. She had always written like someone who expected her words to be read someday. At first glance, nothing seemed alarming. Dates, short notes, a few addresses written in the margins. No explanations, no titles, just information without context. The kind of thing that means nothing until suddenly it means everything. What caught my attention was the consistency. The same day of the week, written over and over again. Monday, always Monday. I sat down at the kitchen table and spread the papers out slowly, as if moving too fast might erase whatever meaning they carried. Some of the dates went back decades, others were more recent. There were gaps, but never breaks. Even in years when our life was chaotic, when we moved, when money was tight, those notes continued without interruption. One address appeared more than once, always written the same way, same spacing, same careful lettering. I didn't recognize it. It wasn't near our home. It wasn't near the clinic. It wasn't anywhere I had ever needed to go. I tried to place it on a map in my head and failed. That unfamiliarity unsettled me more than any secret ever could. What disturbed me most wasn't what was written. It was what wasn't. No emotional language, no explanations, no reminders, just facts. As if Eleanor had stripped the story down to its bones, trusting that whoever found it would understand when the time was right. And for the first time, I wondered if that person had always been meant to be me. I folded the papers back into the folder and held it in my hands longer than necessary. My heart wasn't racing. I wasn't panicking. I felt something quieter and heavier settle into place. The certainty that whatever she had been doing every Monday morning was planned, deliberate, and larger than the safe explanation I had been clinging to. I realized then that Eleanor hadn't been hiding from me. She had been preparing me, not with words, not with warnings, but with breadcrumbs placed carefully enough that I wouldn't notice them until I was ready to follow. And standing there alone in the kitchen, I understood that once you pick up the first real piece of the truth, you can never put it back down. I waited a few days before going there, not because I was afraid, but because I needed the house to stop feeling like it was watching me. That address sat in my pocket like a quiet weight, not heavy enough to hurt, but impossible to forget. On a Monday morning, without thinking too much about the irony, I got in the car and followed the route she must have taken countless times. The neighborhood wasn't what I expected. No hospitals, no clinics, no tall buildings with glass doors and quiet waiting rooms. It was older, quieter, lined with trees that had outlived most of the houses around them. The kind of place where people mind their business and time moves a little slower. If Eleanor had been coming here every Monday for 35 years, it had been hiding in plain sight. I parked across the street and sat there longer than I planned to. The building itself was unremarkable. Brick, Clean, no sign explaining what happened inside. No schedule posted on the door, just a small plaque near the entrance, the kind you only notice if you're looking for it. Whatever this place was, it wasn't trying to be found. People came and went, but not the way I expected. No crowds, no urgency, just individuals, arriving alone, leaving alone, rarely speaking to each other. Some stayed for minutes, others for much longer. Watching them felt intrusive, like I was observing something personal without permission, and that made me uncomfortable in a way I couldn't quite explain. I finally crossed the street and stood in front of the door. For a moment, I imagined Eleanor doing the same thing, straightening her coat, steadying her breath, stepping inside without hesitation. That image unsettled me more than any document or conversation had so far. Whatever happened in that building required calm, preparation, commitment. Inside, the air was quiet, but not cold. The kind of quiet that comes from people choosing not to speak rather than being told not to. A woman at a small desk looked up and smiled politely, not surprised to see me, not curious enough to ask why I was there. I gave my name. She nodded, as if it meant something, then hesitated, as if it almost didn't. She asked who I was here to see. I didn't know how to answer. I almost said my wife's name, then stopped myself. Instead, I mentioned the address, the dates, Mondays. Her expression didn't change, but something behind her eyes did. Recognition, maybe. Or caution. She told me they couldn't share information, then added quietly that some things were meant to be understood, not explained. I walked back outside, feeling less informed than when I arrived. Whatever I had expected to find there, confirmation or denial, relief or fear, none of it appeared. Instead, I was left with a deeper sense of dislocation. This place didn't fit the story of illness. It didn't fit the story of secrecy born from weakness. It fit something else entirely, something structured, something intentional. Driving away, I realized that the more I followed Eleanor's trail, the less it pointed backward. It wasn't explaining the past. It was leading me forward, step by step, into a truth that clearly didn't want to be rushed. And for the first time, I understood that the real mistake wouldn't be discovering what she had been doing. It would be assuming I already knew why. I went back home with a feeling I couldn't name, something between being watched and being remembered. The house felt different that evening, not emptier, just more aware of me, as if the walls had finally noticed I was alone. I sat in Eleanor's chair without thinking. The one she always claimed was more comfortable. And for the first time I wondered how many decisions she had made from that exact spot without ever including me. It was her handwriting that returned to me again, not on paper this time, but in memory. The way she wrote grocery lists with unnecessary care, the way she labeled boxes even when we both knew what was inside. She believed in clarity, but only when clarity was safe. Everything else she treated like a fragile object, something that needed to be wrapped, protected, delayed. I found myself opening drawers I had ignored for years, not searching for proof, but for traces. A receipt folded too carefully, a pen she kept even after it stopped working, a small envelope with my name on it, not sealed, not hidden, simply placed between documents we both considered unimportant. Inside was a note, short, almost casual, written years ago in her steady hand, saying only that some things would make sense later. That sentence unsettled me more than anything else I had seen so far. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't a warning. It was an assumption that I would still be here, that I would keep going, that I would eventually understand. For the first time, I realized Eleanor hadn't been planning for her absence. She had been planning for my survival inside it. I began replaying moments I once thought were insignificant, times she asked my opinion on things that seemed unrelated, questions about trust, about patience, about whether silence could ever be a form of kindness. I had answered honestly, without realizing those answers were being stored, weighed, and used as part of a much larger decision. That night, I didn't sleep. Not because I was afraid, but because something had shifted. I wasn't chasing Eleanor anymore. I was following a path she had laid out, one that required me to become someone slightly different than the man I had been when she was alive. Someone willing to wait. Someone willing to listen without demanding explanation. By the time the sun came up, I understood something that left me breathless in its simplicity. Whatever Eleanor had been doing every Monday morning, it wasn't something that happened to her. It was something she chose. And every choice she made had quietly included me, not as a bystander, but as the final witness, the one she trusted to stand at the end of the story and hold it without breaking. The thought didn't come to me all at once. It surfaced slowly, the way certain truths do when your mind is finally quiet enough to hear them. Eleanor hadn't been going there for herself, not for comfort, not for reassurance. She had been showing up, week after week, because someone else needed her to. Once that idea settled in, everything I had seen before began to rearrange itself. The precision, the discipline, the way she never missed a Monday, no matter what was happening in our lives. People don't protect routines like that unless they're protecting a person, someone who depends on consistency, someone who can't afford interruptions. I remembered how careful she was with language whenever those mornings came up. She never said she had to go. She said she was expected. That detail had meant nothing to me before. Now it echoed. You don't say that unless absence would leave a mark, unless your presence is more than symbolic, unless someone is counting the minutes until you arrive. The building I had visited, the quiet desk, the cautious eyes of the woman who greeted me, it all made sense in a way that didn't bring clarity, only weight. That place wasn't about treatment. It wasn't about recovery. It was about containment, about keeping something steady, about making sure a situation didn't unravel. I began to think about the kind of person Eleanor was, the kind who stepped in when others stepped away, the kind who absorbed problems without announcing them. If someone was being protected, it wasn't because they were powerful, it was because they were vulnerable. And Eleanor had always gravitated toward the vulnerable, even when it cost her. What unsettled me most wasn't the idea that she'd been protecting someone. It was the realization that she had done it without asking for help, without seeking recognition, without letting anyone, including me, share the burden. That kind of protection doesn't come from obligation. It comes from a promise made quietly, long before anyone else knows it exists. And for the first time since the phone call, I understood why the truth hadn't surfaced earlier. Because revealing it wouldn't just explain her Mondays, it would expose someone else's life, someone whose safety, dignity, or future depended on Eleanor keeping her word. Whatever she had been doing, it wasn't a secret meant to die with her. It was a secret meant to be handed over, carefully, when the time was right. The more I sat with it, the more the word protect stopped feeling poetic and started feeling clinical. This wasn't just Eleanor shielding someone's feelings. It was her trying to keep a situation from turning into a medical disaster. The kind that leaves a paper trail. The kind that brings questions. The kind that doesn't stay contained once it starts. I went back through memories the way you flip through old photographs, except the edges were sharp now. There were Mondays when she came home and went straight to the sink, washing her hands longer than usual, scrubbing under her nails like she had touched something she didn't want to carry into our home. There were days she changed her clothes the moment she stepped inside, not in a casual way, but in a hurry. Like time mattered, like cleanliness mattered. I had chalked it up to her being careful. Now I heard a different explanation whispering behind it. Eleanor never talked about blood, never talked about needles, never talked about clinics or tests, but she did something else that I can't stop thinking about. She bought supplies, always from different places. A few items here, a few there, nothing that looked suspicious on its own. Bandages, gauze, disinfectant, a little thermometer that disappeared into a drawer I never opened. And once, I remember seeing a small paper bag tucked inside the trash, folded down tight, like it was hiding what had been inside. She caught me looking and smiled, too quickly, then asked me if I could take the trash out early that week. If she was protecting someone from medical consequences, then she wasn't just showing up to reassure them. She was managing something, monitoring symptoms, preventing a spiral, trying to keep someone stable enough to avoid an emergency room, avoid an official diagnosis, avoid anyone who might ask the wrong questions. And suddenly, her Mondays felt less like appointments and more like check-ins with a ticking clock. I told myself not to assume the worst, but my mind wouldn't let go of the patterns. Eleanor was always calm, but there were moments where her calm looked rehearsed, like she had practiced it because panic wasn't an option, like she had learned how to keep her face steady even when a situation was escalating. I used to think it was just her personality. Now I wondered if she'd been doing it for years, in rooms where someone's health could turn in a matter of minutes. The call from the doctor started to make sense in a terrifying new way. Doctors don't call you like that because they miss a patient. They call you because something is unfinished, because something is unresolved, because someone else is involved. And if Eleanor's routine was tied to protecting someone's health, then her death didn't just end a chapter. It exposed a problem that had been held together by her hands alone. I drove back to the building, not because I expected answers, but because I couldn't sit in my house with the silence anymore. The parking lot looked the same, but I didn't. I walked slower this time, noticing details I had ignored before, the way the windows were tinted, the way the entrance was slightly off to the side, not facing the main road, the way there was no big sign that said what the place really was. It was the kind of building you passed without thinking, unless you were one of the people who needed it. Inside, the same woman was at the desk, but when she saw me, her posture changed. She didn't smile. She didn't greet me like a visitor. She looked at me like someone who might become a problem. I told her my name again. I told her I just needed to understand what my wife had been doing there for 35 years. And for a moment, I saw something flicker in her eyes. Not sympathy, not fear. Something closer to calculation. She asked me to wait. That was new. Last time she had deflected. This time she disappeared behind a door and stayed gone long enough that my stomach tightened. I could hear faint movement in the back, low voices, a drawer opening and closing, the click of a lock. And when she came back, she was holding a folder. Not a thin one, a heavy one, worn at the corners, like it had been handled carefully and often. She set it on the counter, but she didn't slide it to me. She kept one hand on it like it belonged to her, like it belonged to the building, like it belonged to the story Eleanor never let me see. Then she leaned in, lowered her voice, and said something that made the air in my lungs feel too heavy to move. "Before I show you anything," she said, "I need to know one thing." I swallowed. "What?" She glanced toward the hallway, like she was checking whether someone was listening, then looked back at me with a seriousness that sent a cold line down my spine. "Did your wife ever tell you," she asked, "who she was really protecting?" I opened my mouth to answer, but nothing came out, because in that moment, I realized the truth wasn't just hidden inside that folder. The truth was walking around somewhere out there, alive, breathing. And one wrong move from me could send their life into a place Eleanor had spent 35 years trying to keep them from reaching. And then, before I could respond, the door behind the desk opened, not the front door, the back door. Someone stepped out from the hallway, and the second I saw the silhouette, my whole body reacted like it recognized a threat before my mind could name it. The woman at the desk turned slightly, as if bracing herself, and the folder under her hand suddenly felt less like paperwork and more like a warning. Whoever was standing there, they weren't surprised to see me. They were waiting for me. And in that split second, I understood why Eleanor's Mondays had never been about her. They had been about keeping this person from facing consequences that could destroy them. But the question I couldn't answer, the one that made my hands go numb against my thighs, was simple. If Eleanor had spent decades protecting them from medical consequences, then what kind of consequences were coming now that she was gone? And why did it feel like I was the only one who didn't know I had just stepped into the middle of it? The person who stepped out from that hallway didn't rush. They didn't look confused or startled. They moved with the kind of caution you only see in someone who has learned how to read a room before speaking. For a brief moment, none of us said anything. The silence stretched, heavy and deliberate, as if everyone understood that once it broke, something irreversible would follow. I tried to focus on details, the way people do when they're overwhelmed, the sound of shoes against the floor, the faint smell of disinfectant in the air, the way the woman at the desk tightened her grip on the folder, like she was holding back a tide. Whoever this was, they weren't just part of Eleanor's routine. They were the reason the routine existed at all. The woman finally spoke, but not to me. She addressed the person behind me, her voice measured, professional, and tense in a way that made my stomach knot. She reminded them of boundaries, of procedures, of things that were no longer being monitored the way they used to be. And when she said Eleanor's name, the reaction was immediate, a sharp inhale, a pause that lasted just a second too long. That was when I saw it. Fear, not the loud kind, the controlled kind, the kind that comes from someone who knows exactly what could happen if the wrong door opens. This wasn't about inconvenience. It wasn't about embarrassment. It was about consequences that couldn't be undone once they started. I finally spoke, asking a simple question, the kind that sounds harmless but carries weight. I asked what Eleanor had been preventing. No one answered me directly. Instead, they spoke around it. They mentioned stability, monitoring, risk, words that belonged in reports and charts, not in the quiet aftermath of a life shared for decades. And every time they avoided my question, the truth grew heavier in the room. It became clear that Eleanor had been doing more than helping. She had been intervening, stepping in at critical moments, making decisions when others hesitated. She had acted as a buffer between a fragile situation and a system that didn't bend easily. Without her, that buffer was gone. And now the responsibility was drifting, looking for somewhere else to land. The person from the hallway finally looked at me, really looked at me, as if weighing something. When they spoke, their voice was lower, stripped of pretense. They said Eleanor trusted me, that she believed I would know what to do when the time came, that she had prepared for this moment long before anyone else thought it necessary. I wanted to argue, to say she should have told me that I wasn't ready for this. But even as those thoughts formed, I understood why she hadn't. If she had explained everything, I might have tried to stop her. I might have insisted on help that would have triggered the very consequences she was avoiding. Her silence hadn't been neglect. It had been strategy. The woman at the desk slid the folder back into her hands, signaling that whatever came next would not happen today. There were steps, conversations, decisions that required care. And then she said something that echoed in my chest long after I left the building. Without Eleanor, she said quietly, the margin for error is gone. Outside, the air felt colder than it should have. I stood there for a moment, staring at the street, trying to understand how a life could be built around preventing something from happening rather than making something happen. Eleanor had spent 35 years keeping a line from being crossed, and now that line was trembling. As I got into my car, one thought refused to let go. If the consequences she had protected someone from were this serious, then whatever was coming next wouldn't just reveal the truth about her Mondays. It would force me to decide whether I was willing to step into the role she had carried alone for so long. And the most terrifying part wasn't that I didn't know if I could do it. It was that I wasn't sure what would happen if I didn't. I didn't realize Eleanor had left me a choice until I was already standing inside it. All those years, I thought her silence had been about control, about keeping things contained. But now I saw it differently. She hadn't been controlling the outcome. She had been preserving the option to choose when everything else failed. The people involved didn't pressure me. That was the part that unsettled me the most. They explained what would happen next if nothing was done. Procedures, evaluations, records that would follow someone for the rest of their life. Not as punishment, but as consequence. Systems don't care about intentions. They only care about what can be documented. They told me Eleanor had insisted on one condition, that if the day ever came when she could no longer show up, the decision would not be made by strangers. It would be made by someone who understood the cost of silence and the weight of love. Someone who knew what protecting someone really meant. I drove home in silence, replaying every conversation I'd ever had with her about responsibility, about patience, about knowing when to step forward and when to step back. None of it felt accidental anymore. She had been teaching me how to stand exactly where I was standing now. That night, I sat at the kitchen table and looked at the empty chair across from me. I finally understood the truth she never said out loud. Love doesn't always mean saving someone. Sometimes it means deciding how much of the truth they can survive, and the choice she left me wasn't simple, it wasn't clean. It wasn't something I could undo once made. Whatever I decided next would either continue the protection she built for 35 years or end it forever. I didn't sleep that night, but by morning I knew one thing for certain. Eleanor hadn't trusted me with the truth. She had trusted me with the ending. I didn't make the decision all at once. It came quietly, the same way Eleanor had handled everything else. I listened. I asked only what I needed to ask. I paid attention to what wasn't being said. And in that space, between risk and responsibility, I understood what she had been protecting all along. I agreed to continue what she started, but not forever. I set conditions, clear ones, boundaries. Eleanor had respected without ever writing them down. This wasn't about hiding the truth. It was about controlling how it arrived, slowly, carefully, in a way that wouldn't destroy a life before it had a chance to stabilize. When I left that building, no one thanked me. There were no assurances, no promises of peace, just a quiet understanding that the burden had shifted. What Eleanor carried alone for 35 years now rested, at least in part, on me. That evening, I stood in the kitchen and realized something that brought an unexpected calm. I wasn't doing this because she asked me to. I was doing it because I finally understood her. And for the first time since she was gone, I felt close to her again, not through memory but through action. Whatever happened next would reveal the truth, but not yet. First, it had to be handled. When I finally met them, there was no drama left to sustain, no careful language, no avoidance, just facts that had waited too long to be spoken. Eleanor hadn't been protecting a secret. She had been protecting a person whose medical condition could never be made public without destroying what little stability they had left. For 35 years, every Monday morning, she showed up to monitor, to intervene, to keep things from escalating into something permanent. Hospital records, official diagnoses, systems that don't forget once a name is written down. She became the buffer so that no institution ever had to step in, no file ever had to be opened. The person she protected wasn't a stranger. They were someone whose life intersected with ours in ways I never questioned, because Eleanor made sure I never had to. Someone whose survival depended on routine, discretion, and the absence of attention. She didn't do it out of guilt. She did it out of responsibility. That was the part that broke me. Eleanor didn't sacrifice herself because she had to. She chose to, every week, for decades. She carried the fear so no one else would have to. And when she felt her time running out, she made sure the truth would land softly, in the hands of someone who wouldn't panic, wouldn't expose, and wouldn't walk away. The doctor's call wasn't a warning, it was a transfer. Eleanor was gone, and the protection she built could no longer exist in silence. Someone had to decide how the truth would finally surface, and how much damage it would cause when it did. I understood then why she never told me. If she had, I might have tried to fix it the wrong way. I might have trusted systems that don't protect people, only procedures. Eleanor trusted something else. She trusted patience. She trusted time. And in the end, she trusted me. Every Monday for 35 years, my wife kept an appointment that was never about her health. It was about keeping someone alive without turning them into a case number. And now that she was gone, the truth didn't arrive as a shock. It arrived as a responsibility. And that was the moment I finally understood who my wife really was.